Hello, Doofer911 here, and today we are going to be taking a look at the before start procedure. So this video leads on from a previous couple of videos where we entered data into the CDUs and the flight management system, and we've also gone through the pre-flight procedure to configure the aircraft and begin to get it ready for engine start. So if you've not seen those videos, I would highly recommend you go back and check those out because everything that we've done in those previous videos has set up the aircraft, prepared it and got it ready for what we are going to cover in this video. Now, another little disclaimer I need to get out of the way before I do this. I am not a commercial pilot, I'm not a 777 pilot, I am a private pilot and I am a flight sim enthusiast. So the procedures that I do in these videos are based on my own study and knowledge of this aircraft, and I've tweaked a couple of things to make it easy for a single person flight simming at home with this aircraft. So some of the procedures might be different to what real world pilots do. Please be aware that I'm just a flight sim enthusiast trying to help other flight sim enthusiasts. So with all of that out of the way, let's crack on and take a look at the before start procedure. So we are going to begin by moving up to the glare shield, and what we're going to do is we're going to set in our V2 speed onto the IAS or the airspeed selector. Now, if you can't remember or if you didn't make a note of what your V2 speed is, that's not a problem. What we can do is we can come down to the CDU here, and if you take a look at the takeoff ref page, this is where you'll find your V speeds here. So the speed that we want is the V2 speed, which for this example is 161 knots. So we're going to dial that in here, 161. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to arm the LNAV and VNAV switches. So this just arms these auto-flight modes. Once we've actually taken off and once we're up in the air and we've got the aircraft stable in a climb, we're then going to enable the autopilot, and it's going to automatically arm the LNAV and VNAV modes, which is going to allow the aircraft to follow the flight path that we've programmed into the flight management system. Next, what we need to do is we need to change the aircraft heading selector, and we need to set that to the runway heading. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring up a chart that I use for flight simming here, and one that we want is the airport chart here. So if we take a look at runway 09 left, that's the runway we're going to be taking off from, we can see that the actual accurate magnetic heading of the runway is actually 089 degrees. So that's what we're going to set to our heading selector here. There we go, 089 degrees here. And the last item we're going to do is we're going to set our altitude to the altitude that we've initially been cleared to. Now, in the previous video, in the previous procedure, I recommended that that was a good time to speak to air traffic control to request your IFR clearance. As part of your IFR clearance, you will be given your initial altitude. Now, if you're not flying with air traffic control, what you can do is you can use the altitude that's been given at the last waypoint of the departure procedure. So I'm just going to bring up my charts again. And if we take a look at the departure procedure we're going to be flying, it's the ULTIB 1 kilo departure here. And you can see at the ULTIB waypoint is going to be 6,000 feet. So normally this correlates with the initial altitude that air traffic control would give you if you were flying with air traffic control. So what we're going to do on the altitude selector there is we're going to enter in 6,000 feet. Now, once again, depending on which airport you're flying from, this is likely to be different. If you're flying with air traffic control, they might give you a different altitude as well. So just make a note of it when you receive your clearance and use that figure as your altitude figure there. So once we're done on the glare shield, now we actually need to change a couple of things or a couple of options in the simulator here. At this point, what's happening is in real life, all of the passengers would have been loaded onto the aircraft, or would have been coming onto the aircraft at this point. You probably got the last few passengers are starting to make their way onto the aircraft just now. So the aircraft is alive, it's awake, it's almost ready to go. So what we need to do is we need to start disconnecting and removing any ground equipment or any ground power that's attached to the aircraft, so that the aircraft is free to move. So to do that, what we need to do is we need to come down to the CDU here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the menu button, which allows us to access the menu options for the simulator. What I'm going to do is go into FS Actions, and the first thing we can do is we can go to ground connections. Oh, not sorry, ground connections. That was ground operations I went to. Ground connections, which is the top line there. And for the dual jetway plugs, what we can do is we can now remove those. So that now takes away any external power, so we're now reliant on the aircraft's APU supplying electrical power to the aircraft. Now what we can also do is, in the previous procedure, we also enabled the parking brake. So now it's safe for us to remove the wheel chocks. With the parking brake enabled, the aircraft is not going to start rolling away anywhere. Now if you're using a sort of a ground add-on like GSX to mimic passenger loading and things like that, what you want to do is you want to wait and make sure that all of your passengers have been loaded onto the aircraft. Then what you can do is you can then go into the doors page, and you can make sure that all of the doors then become closed. And then once all of the doors are closed, you can then arm them. So what this does is what the flight crews normally do is they arm the doors, so that if the door is open in flight, it will typically also enable the inflatable slide that is attached to the door as well when the doors are armed. So once you've closed all of the doors in the simulator and make sure that they're all armed, the last thing you can do is you can go into the pushback menu and you begin to configure the pushback options. Now in the last video we did a kind of a pre-flight briefing. We know that we want to turn the nose of the aircraft to the left, so that would point the aircraft to the north and point us towards runway 09 left. Now we also want to make sure that the nose of the aircraft is turned through 90 degrees, or like so. If you're not sure, don't be afraid to jump to an external view, take a look outside of the plane, take a look at where the taxiway is, and figure out which direction you want to go there. Okay, and lastly, you can also adjust the total distance that you're going to be pushed back. Oops, sorry, I do apologise for that there. Now, I'm not really any good at manually calculating the distance. This is a sort of a built-in pushback feature with the PMDG 777. Once again, if you're using third-party software which mimics pushback and things like that, that might be better and more accurate at controlling the aircraft's position. For this, I'm just going to leave it here. It's probably not going to push us back onto the taxiway correctly, but it's only a simulator. I'm not taking it too seriously, so I'm not going to worry about where the aircraft ends up, thankfully. Anyway, so once you've checked your pushback options and made sure that everything is correct there, that's all of the actions that we need to do for preparing the simulator and the different simulator options for departure. So once that's been done, what we can do is we can come back up to the glare shield, and we actually want to just confirm that all of the doors have been closed and armed. So what we can do is we can come over to the lower centered display selector here, and we can click on the door page and just take a quick look at the lower centered display and make sure that all 8 doors have been closed and armed there, as confirmed with the green A for every door. Okay, so now things are going to start getting exciting. Next step, what we're going to do is we're going to come to the overhead panel here, and now we are going to start pressurizing the various hydraulic systems within the aircraft. So first we're going to go to the right electric demand pump selector, and we're going to set that to auto. Next, we're going to go to the center 1 and center 2 electric primary pump switches. It's these two switches here, and we're going to set both of these to be on. Next, we're going to go down to the left electric demand pump selector, and we're going to set this to the auto position. And then finally, we're going to look at the center 1 and center 2 air demand pump selectors, and we're going to set both of these to the on position here. Now you'll notice that as I switch these different systems on, the fault lights began to disappear as the systems become pressurized. That's no problem at all there. Next, we're going to move across to the fuel panel, and now we're also going to start enabling the fuel pumps. So on the left and right side, we're going to enable the left and right fuel pumps, and we're going to enable both the forward and aft fuel pumps, and as you saw, the fault lights there disappeared. Now next, if you have more than 3,400 kilograms or 7,500 pounds of fuel in the center tanks, you want to turn the center tanks on as well. Now to check that, what you can do is you can take a look at the lower display here. If we go over to the display selector, set it onto the fuel page, and we can take a look and see how much fuel we have in the center tanks. So you can see at the moment we have 47,000 pounds of fuel in the center tanks. So that's above our 7,500 kind of minimum limit. So what we can do is we can go back to the overhead, and we will turn on the center tank pumps there as well. Now, if the aircraft has an auxiliary fuel pump or a fuel tank enabled, you will also see an auxiliary fuel pump switch on this panel as well. Once again, you want to just double check the auxiliary fuel tank and see how much fuel is in there. If you have more than 100 kilograms or 200 pounds of fuel, then switch on the auxiliary fuel pump switch. Next, because we're now very close to starting the engines, what we can do is turn on the beacon light. So this is a red or orange flashing light on the top and the bottom of the aircraft, and this is just a visual indicator to people outside of the aircraft that the engines are about to be started, or they are running, or they have been shut down but they're still running quite fast and they're quite hot. So it's basically a warning to people outside of the aircraft: do not approach the aircraft because the engines are about to be started. Now if we come back down to the ECAS display here, what we want to do, whoops, my camera view will stop going crazy there. So what we want to do, you'll notice now that we've pressurized a lot of the systems, we've lost a lot of warnings here on the ECAS display here, or a lot of cautions. So what we want to do now is we want to clear these last couple of cautions, and we can do that by going up to the display selector panel here and press the cancel and recall button. So we'll press that button there, and that just clears out the last couple of cautions in preparation for engine starts. What I'm going to do is just change my view to the captain's side here. The next step that we need to do is we need to set the stabilizer trim. Now if you can't remember what trim value you should be using, if you come back to the flight management computer portion of the CDU here, on the takeoff ref page we have the trim value there, which is set to 3.75. Now there's two ways that we can check this. We can set it either by using the trim indicator here. That's a little inaccurate though. You can figure out where the trim setting needs to be, but if you want a more accurate reading, we can use the lower center display again. If we come up to the display selector, select the flight control page, look down again, and now I'm just going to use my trim controls on my joystick here. So we're just going to amend the stabilizer trim, which is this value here, and we're going to set that to 3.75. There we go. So just push forward on the trim there, and the stabilizer trim is now set to 3.75. So you'll notice that the trim will move in 0.25 increments. So if I was to keep trimming just now, you see it drops to 3.5, 3.25, and 3 there. So move that back to 3.75. That matches what we have calculated for takeoff. After that, we want to check the aileron trim, and we can do that by taking a look at the yoke control here. So we want to make sure that this white marker matches the 0 degrees aileron trim on the yoke there. And then lastly, if we come back down to the pedestal, we're going to have a look at the rudder trim here. So we'll check the rudder trim indicator, make sure that's set to 0, and if that's not, we can adjust the rudder trim as needed. Alternatively, you can just press the manual trim cancel button and make sure that the rudder trim is set to 0. Okay, so with that, that is the end of the before start procedure. However, there is a before start checklist that we need to go through before we finish up here. So if I change my view to the virtual cockpit view here, bring up the checklist page on the electronic checklist, and then let's walk through the checklist here. So the flight deck door, we can manually mark this as being closed and locked. Now for the mode control panel, we started off the procedure by entering our V2 speed, which is 161. We changed our heading to 089 degrees for the runway heading, and we've set our altitude to 6,000 feet for the departure procedure. We have our takeoff speeds calculated in the CDU here, which are 160, V rotate at 160, and V2 is at 161, so we can enter that in there. The CDU pre-flight procedure we completed, we did that a couple of videos ago. So we've entered in all of the navigation data, we've also entered in all of the performance data, so that's been completed. So the trim, we've set the trim to 3.75 units on the stabilizer trim, and we've also just checked the aileron trim and also the rudder trim and made sure both of those are set to 0. Finally, the taxi and takeoff briefing. If you didn't do it in the previous video, once again, now would be a good time to do the taxi and takeoff briefing, so that all of the flight crews or all of the staff in the flight deck are aware of what's going, where the aircraft is likely to be told to taxi, what the takeoff procedure is and the departure procedure is. So we did all of that in the previous video, so we can now tick that off and mark that as being completed. Then, as the cursor jumps down to normal, we can tap on normal, and that automatically brings us to the next checklist, which we will do in a future video. Okay, so leading on from the before engine start procedure, logically, is the engine start procedure. So we're going to cover that just now as well. So at this point, if you are flying with air traffic control, now is the time to request engine start clearance and also, if applicable, pushback clearance from air traffic control. Air traffic control will give you the clearance when they're ready for you to taxi, and they will tell you to push back, and at a large airport they're likely to tell you which direction the plane needs to be turned. So I believe at Heathrow they will tell you to either face north or south or east or west, depending on which direction you need to go. So for this, we know that we need to turn the nose of the aircraft to the left, which would be turning the aircraft to face the north. So air traffic control would give us clearance to push and start, and then we will push and start. So to do that, in the PMDG Boeing 777, what we will do is come back down to the menu here on the CDU. We will go into FS Actions. We will go into the pushback page, and then we will start the pushback procedure.
And ground cockpit.
Go ahead, Captain.
We're all set to go up here. We've been cleared to push and start at your discretion.
Roger that, ready for push. Power and air are clear, doors closed, we are ready for pushback. Please mark and brake, please.
Okay, so you can hear a bit of simulated audio there. It simulates the pilots talking to a member of crew on the ground. Now you heard the last instruction there was to release the parking brake. So when you're given that instruction, simply release the parking brake, and you hear some more simulated audio of a pilot speaking to a ground crew member.
Okay, parking brake is off, cleared to push.
Brakes off, here we go.
Okay, and once you get that confirmation from the ground crew, we will see that the aircraft is now starting to be pushed back. Now, as I said, I'm not too experienced with doing pushbacks in the simulator, so I'm not sure exactly where the aircraft is going to end up in relation to the taxiway, but we'll deal with it as and when it happens. So, as we're pushing back, we can now start the engines. So what we want to do is we want to change the lower center display, and we want to change that to the secondary engine page, like so. What this will do is this will allow the pilots to monitor the engine measurements as the engine starts. So as we're getting pushed back, we're going to announce the engine start sequence. So which engine are we going to start first, then which engine are we going to start second. For this flight, what I'm going to do is start the number 2 engine, so that's the right hand engine. We're going to start that first, and then we'll start the number 1 or the left hand engine. So we'll do engine number 2, then engine number 1.
Push is complete. Set parking brake, please.
Before I do that, as you heard, the pushback has been completed. As you can see, we're way off the taxiway there. It's not a problem. You know, just be aware that if you are flying using VATSIM or something like that, you might want to make sure that the pushback occurs more accurately. So we got the instruction from the ground crew there to re-enable the parking brake, so we're going to do that there.
Brakes are set and pressure's normal.
Okay, sir. Tow bar is on. Pin is out. Watch the pin on the right.
Alright guys, thanks. You're cleared to disconnect. We will be watching for the pin and the release from guidance on the right side of the airplane, and we'll see you guys next time through.
Roger that. Have a good flight.
Okay, so once all of that's been done, you can now return the CDU back to the FMC page, and it will automatically jump back to the takeoff ref page, which is kind of the page that you want to have at the moment, so that's absolutely fine. Okay, so we were going to start engine 2, then engine number 1. Now, starting the engines in the 777 is relatively simple compared to something like a Boeing 737. What we have in the Boeing 777 is an auto start system. So you'll know that if you've flown an aircraft like the Boeing 737, that you need to wait for the engines to spool up to a certain speed before you introduce the fuel to the engine, which then allows the engine to speed up to its idle speed. That's not the case in the 777. As I've said in the previous video, it is a quote-unquote smart aircraft, and it has this auto start system that will do that automatically for you. So what we need to do is take a look at the overhead panel first of all. So we're going to be start engine number 2 first of all. That's the right hand engine. What we want to do is come up to the engine panel here, and we simply want to move the engine start selector to the start position. Now you hear that the air conditioning packs turn off, because what they're now doing is all of the bleed air that's being generated by the APU is now being pushed into the engine to start speeding it up. Once the engine has started spooling up, we can move the fuel control lever down here under the thrust levers to the run position. Now once the core of the engine is at the correct speed, the aircraft will automatically open up the fuel valves and introduce fuel flow into the engine, and manage that fuel flow so that the engine starts up correctly, starts up nice and gently, and starts up as it should. At about 64 on the N2 there, you heard a little click, so that was the overhead start switch clicking back into the normal position. Now what pilots will do is they'll just be keeping an eye on all of the measurements there, making sure that nothing goes outside of its tolerance or nothing odd happens there. So that's engine number 2 started. Now we're going to start engine number 1. So we're just going to come back to the overhead panel again, flick that to the start position. Once we get a bit of movement on the N2 there, we can come straight back to the fuel control switch, flick that on at any point, As I said, you don't need to wait for the engine to reach a certain speed, you can just flick it on at any point. And we're just monitoring the engine instruments here for the left engine, make sure that everything is rising, so the oil pressure is increasing, oil temperature will increase. You'll notice that the oil quantity changes a little bit as well. We have a bit of vibration there. So we get fuel flow, you'll notice that the exhaust temperature increases, and as the fuel flow enters the engine, that's when you start to see the engine accelerate up to its idle speed. And you hear that click, so that was the overhead switch flicking back into its normal position. And just keep an eye on the engine for a couple more seconds just to make sure that it does settle at its idle speed there. And with that, that is the engine start procedure all completed. So at this point, the aircraft is now been pushed back, it's away from the gate, and we are ready to go. So in the next video, we're going to be taking a look at the before taxi procedure. Then we're also going to taxi the aircraft out to the runway, and then we'll take a look at preparing the aircraft for takeoff after that. So until the next time, thank you all very much for watching, take care out there, and I will catch you all later.